Hello everyone, Brad from the PDH Pod here with Game 1 of the Pauper Commander stream from December 9th, 2023. Before we get to the game, use the buttons below to like and subscribe, and remember to tune in to the PDH Pod podcast every Friday for more Pauper Commander talk. Holy game actions, Batman. We've got a little bit longer of a video this time around, but all four commanders are very interesting, inherently interactive, and quite powerful. With so many constantly moving pieces, there was a lot to keep up with, which tends to happen when three of the four commanders at the table are blue, but it turned out to be a wildly fun game. Speaking of the game, let's introduce everyone's commanders. First up, we've got Hive Cryptid playing Student of Elements. It's a 1/1 human wizard for a generic and a blue that says, when Student of Element has flying, you flip it. And the other side is Tobita, Master of Winds, a 3/3 human wizard that says, creatures you control have flying. Going second is Ruffigan, a Pauper Commander Rules Committee member, playing Imoti, Celebrant of Bounty, a 3/1 legendary creature Naga Druid for 3, a green and a blue with Cascade, and that also says spells you cast with converted mana cost 6 or greater have Cascade. Going third is Brennan, and he's playing Stromkirk Captain, a 2/2 vampire soldier for a generic, a black and a red that has first strike, and other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1 and have first strike. And going last, in the fourth seat, we've got me, your host, Brad Dragfee from the PDH Pod, and I'm playing Azorius Aethermage, a 1/1 human wizard for a generic, a white, and a blue that says, whenever a permanent is returned to your hand, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. All four players resolve opening hands and mulligans, and we're off. Hive starts the game by playing an island, and then passes the turn. Ruffigan draws for turn, and also plays an island. He doesn't have any turn 1 plays, so he passes. Brennan draws to start his turn. He plays a Vault of Whispers, then gets the threats rolling with a turn 1 Changeling Outcast. He passes the turn. I draw to start my first turn and play a Command Tower. I don't have any plays here, so I pass it over to Hive. Hive draws for turn, then plays another island. They tap both of them to play their commander, Student of Elements. Hive passes after that. Ruffigan draws but doesn't need to untap. He plays a forest, then casts a 3 visits to put a Rimewood Falls into play. While he's searching his library, he passes the turn. Brennan untaps and draws. He puts a snow-covered swamp into play. He moves to combat and swings 1 unblockable damage at Hive. Brennan has no second main phase play, so he passes it to me. I draw for turn. After playing a Plains and realizing I still don't have anything to play, I pass the turn. Hive untaps and draws for turn. They play another island, then move directly to combat. They send the student over at Brennan for a little payback. Brennan has nothing to block with, so, before damage, Hive returns the student back to their hand to ninjutsu in a Mist Blade Shinobi. The Shinobi connects with Brennan, then triggers to bounce the Changeling Outcast back to his hand. Second main phase, Hive recasts Student of Elements, then passes the turn. Ruffigan untaps and draws for the turn. He puts another island into play, then taps 3 to cast a Fierce Empath, which allows him to tutor up a creature with mana value 6 or greater. Ruffigan says he's going to find a Krosan Tusker, but to keep the game moving along, he passes to Brennan while searching. Brennan untaps and draws. He plays a Path of Ancestry, which comes into play tapped, then recasts his Changeling Outcast. With nothing left to play, he passes the turn. I don't need to untap, but I do draw for turn. I put an island into play, and finally having the mana to do something, I tap out to play my commander. I pass it over to Hive after that. Untap, upkeep, draw for Hive to start the turn. They play a Forge of Heroes, then pay a blue mana to cycle Windcaller Aven, which, when cycled, gives target creature flying until the end of turn. Hive targets their commander with this effect, and it flips into Tobita, Master of Winds. They resolve the cycling of the Aven to draw a card, then move to combat. After weighing some options, Hive swings everything at Ruffigan, who currently has no way to block flying creatures. Hive bounces the Fierce Empath to Ruffigan's hand. Second main phase, Hive casts a Stealer of Secrets, then passes the turn. Ruffigan untaps and draws for turn. He plays another island, then taps everything to cast his commander, Imoti, and the fun is underway. It doesn't take long to cascade into a Lignify. Ruffigan gets to cast it for free and decides to target the Master of Winds to make it an 0/4 Tree Folk and lose all abilities. Ruffigan passes the turn after Lignify resolves. Brennan untaps, then draws for turn. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, then taps 3 to play his commander. He moves to combat and swings the now 2-powered Outcast at me. After combat, Brennan passes the turn. I untap and draw for turn. I put a Plains into play, then tap both to play Gossamer Chains. I play an Obscura Storefront, and somehow all 4 players missed that I already played a land for turn. Decades of playing Magic, and I still forgot the things I did only seconds before. I pass the turn. Hive untaps and draws for turn. They put another island into play and pay 2 to cast a Runaway together, targeting Tobita and Imoti. The spell resolves and both commanders are returned to their owner's hands. Hive moves to combat, sending both of their creatures over at Ruffigan, who has no blockers. On damage, Hive draws a card off the Stealer of Secrets. Second main phase, they tap another 2 islands to replay Student of Elements, then taps Forge of Heroes to put a +1/+1 counter on it. They pass the turn after that. Ruffigan untaps his lands, then draws for turn. He plays a tapped Tangled Islet for turn, then taps out again to spin the wheel with Imoti. Ruffigan cascades into Resculpt, which he casts to exile the Stealer of Secrets and replaces it with a 4/4 red and blue elemental creature token. Ruffigan passes the turn after that. Brennan untaps, then draws to start his turn. He plays another Snow Swamp, then taps 3 to put a Bonder's Ornament into play. Brennan moves to combat and swings the Outcast at Ruffigan. In response, and in desperate need of some gas, I return Gossamer Chains to my hand to have the Outcast deal no damage this turn. I also pay for the Aethermage's ability to draw a card. After combat, Brennan passes the turn. I untap and draw to begin my turn. I then tap 2 to cast Contempt, targeting Hive's biggest creature, the Elemental. After that, I put an Azorius Chancery into play. It bounces a Plains to my hand, and I pay 1 for Aethermage's ability to draw a card. Not wanting to risk my commander in combat or tap out to play anything else, I pass the turn. Hive untaps their lands and draws for turn. They tap 1 to play a Wingcrafter. It enters the battlefield and soul bonds itself to Student of Elements to flip it into Tobita, which is now a 4/4 due to the previous Forge of Heroes counter. Hive then moves to combat, sending Tobita at me and the Shinobi at Ruffigan. Neither of us have any blocks, so we take our damage, and Hive chooses not to bounce a creature with the Shinobi's ability. During their second main phase, Hive casts a Kinscare Harpoonist, which may cause another creature to lose flying when it attacks. Hive plays another island for their turn and passes. Ruffigan untaps and draws to start his turn. He plays another island, then bemoans having to pay full retail for a Mirror Enforcer. He does get the Imoti Cascade trigger, though. After missing on the first couple of cards, he cascades into an Into the Royal, which he casts for free to bounce the Harpoonist back to Hive's hand. Being fully tapped out again, Ruffigan passes the turn. Brennan untaps, then draws for turn. He taps 4 mana to cast a Trailblazer's Torch to introduce the initiative to the game. He ventures into the Secret Entrance to fetch a Snow Swamp and plays it for turn. He then pays 1 for a Voldaran Stinger. The mana he used was filtered through Path of Ancestry, so he scries a card to the top of his library. Brennan moves to combat and sends the Outcast in my direction. Having no interaction, I take 2 damage. Brennan skips over the second main phase to pass the turn. I untap and draw for turn, then replay the Plains from the previous turn. I tap said Plains and the Chancery to cast a Cage of Hands, targeting Ruff's Mirror Enforcer. I then garner the table's attention by casting Ethereal Armor, targeting my commander. I move to my first attack of the game by sending damage towards Brennan. In response, he targets Aethermage with Skred. In response to that, I target Aethermage with Scroll Shift, which protects it and draws me a card, but also takes it out of combat and sends Ethereal Armor to the bin. Super sad. Having no available resources for which to cast spells, I skip my second main phase and pass the turn over to Hive. Untap, upkeep, and draw for Hive to start their turn. They play an island and skip main phase 1 to move directly to combat. Hive sends Tobita and the Shinobi at Brennan and the Wingcrafter at me. Neither of us have anything to block with, so we take our damage and Hive gains the initiative. They fetch an island from the secret entrance. To start their second main phase, they pay 4 to recast Kinscare Harpoonist, then cast Updraft, targeting my Aethermage to give it flying until the end of turn. More importantly, though, Updraft allows Hive to draw a card during the next upkeep. They pass the turn. Ruffigan untaps. Hive draws a card off Updraft, and Ruff draws a card for turn. He then taps 3 to cycle the Krosan Tusker, which draws him a card and fetches up a forest. Ruff pays 3 to cast Fierce Empath again. Its ability triggers, and he tutors up a Treasure Cruise to his hand. Ruff passes the turn after that. Brennan untaps and draws. He plays a Command Tower, then pays 4 to cast a Siphon Mind. Hive and Ruffigan both discard an island, and I pitch an Opal Palace. Brennan draws 3 cards off Siphon Mind, then moves to combat. He sends the Outcast at Hive and the Stinger at me. Brennan opts not to pump the Stinger, so Hive and I each take 2 damage. Brennan regains the initiative and moves into the Forge. He puts 2+1 counters on the Changeling Outcast. All done with his turn, he passes to me. I untap everything and draw for turn. I start off by tapping both of my planes to cast Gossamer Chains again. I then pay 3 to cast Martial Impetus, targeting Tobita. My land for turn is a Mystic Sanctuary, which comes into play tapped and sad. Having not much else to do, I pass the turn with 2 cards in hand. Hive untaps and draws to start the turn. They move directly to combat, choosing to send the Harpoonist, the Wingcrafter, and the Shinobi at Brennan, and Tobita at Ruffigan. Martial Impetus triggers, giving Hive's other creatures +1/+1 until the end of turn. Neither defending player has anything to block with, so damage is taken. This puts Ruff at 8 commander damage from Tobita. With the Shinobi damage trigger, Hive bounces the Outcast back to Brennan's hand. Also on combat damage, Hive regains the initiative. They join Brennan in the Forge and put 2 +1 counters on Wingcrafter. Second main phase, Hive decides to go big instead of going home and taps out to cast Marauding Brinefang, a 6/7 dino with Ward 3 and Island Cycling for 2. Satisfied with this, Hive passes the turn. Ruffigan untaps and draws. He plays the recently fetched Forest for turn, then pays 4 for a discounted Tolarian Terror. This triggers Imoti to let Ruffigan cascade for a spell that costs 6 or less. He rips a Thundering Tanadon off the top of his deck and puts it into play. Having mana value of 6, the Tanadon triggers Imoti again for another round of Cascade. Ruffigan hits the Nature's Lore, casting it for free to fetch a forest and put it directly into play. Taking a moment to mull over his options and unable to attack with his Mirror Enforcer, Ruffigan decides to pass the turn. On Ruffigan's end step, Brennan casts a Doomblade, targeting Tobita. The spell resolves and Brennan moves to his turn. He untaps and draws for turn, then plays a Snow Mountain. He casts Changeling Outcast for a 3rd time, followed by a Marauding Blight Priest. He taps another 2 to play Thought Vessel. After some negotiating to get the initiative back, Brennan moves to combat and swings the Stinger at Hive for 2 damage. He also sends his commander at me. In response, I return Gossamer Chains back to my hand and pay the 1 for Aethermage, so the captain deals no damage in combat and I draw a card. Brennan regains the initiative and moves into the arena room to goad Azorius Aethermage. After combat, Brennan passes the turn. I untap and draw to start my turn. In another installment of Brad Can't Read Magic Cards, I tap a single planes to cast Shackles, targeting the Voldaren Stinger. This will be rectified later, though. Shackles resolves, then I pay 3 for a Starnheim Courser. Needing more card draw and wanting to avoid as much future command attacks as possible, I target the Aethermage with Call to Heal, which bounces a creature and draws its controller a card. I pay the 1 for Aethermage's ability to draw another card. I then play an island as my land for turn. I have nothing to attack with, so I pass the turn with 4 cards in hand. Hive untaps and draws for turn. They start by paying 4 for Student of Elements, and Hive soul bonds it to Wingcrafter to give both creatures flying. This flips the student into Tobita. Hive then taps Forge of Heroes to put a +1 counter on their commander. Then they move to combat and ominously proclaim that they will be taking the initiative back. They send the Harpoonist at Brennan, the Wingcrafter at me, and the 6/7 and 1/1 at Ruffigan. The Harpoonist ability triggers, and Hive chooses to take flying away from my Courser. In response to attackers being declared, Ruff casts Prying Eyes, which triggers Emoti's Cascade ability for a spell of 5 mana value or less. Ruffigan cascades into another draw spell, Soul Read. All in all, Ruffigan draws 2 cards off Soul Read, then draws 4 cards and discards 2 off Prying Eyes. After the stack has cleared, nobody has any way to deal with Hive's flyers, so we all take our damage. Hive regains the initiative and joins Brennan in the arena, choosing to goad Imoti. After combat, Hive passes the turn. Ruffigan untaps and draws. He plays a Darksteel Citadel as his land for turn. His first action is to play a Deep Freeze, targeting Tobita, so that it loses all abilities and becomes a 0/4 blue wall with Defender. It's at about this time I realize I only paid 1 for Shackles, so I tap my 2 open mana to cover the rest. Ruffigan continues his turn by paying 2 to cast Mindstone, then pays 6 mana to cast an Ambush Crotique, and chooses to bounce his commander back to hand. Imoti was still on board when Ruff put the Crotique on the stack, so he gets a Cascade trigger. He wheels into a blink of an eye and casts it for free to return Contempt back to my hand. After that, Ruff moves to combat, sending the Tanadon at me. After a bit of internal debate, I decide to take the full 5 damage. I mean, it's only life, right? Ruffigan passes the turn after combat. Brennan untaps, then draws for turn. He plays a Sulphurous Mire as his land for turn, then moves directly to combat. The unblockable Outcast heads towards Hive, and the Blight Priest comes at me. I choose not to block, so I take 4. Hive can't block, so they take 2 and swap the initiative back to Brennan. He ventures into the Catacombs and creates a 4/1 black skeleton creature token with Menace. After that, Brennan passes the turn. I untap and draw to start my turn. I start by paying 3 to recast Aethermage, then pay a single white to return Shackles to my hand, and pay the extra 1 to draw a card off my commander's ability. Using the Courser's discount, I recast Contempt for a single blue mana, targeting the Pteranodon. After much deliberation, I decide to just pass the turn. At my end step, Hive casts Capsizing Wave, the adventure half of Sword Coast Serpent, to bounce Topita back to their hand. The stack resolves, and we move to Hive's turn. Hive untaps and draws for turn. They tap 2 islands and, as a surprise to nobody, recast Student of Elements yet again. It enters the battlefield soul-bonded to Wingcrafter, which, again, flips it into Tobita, Master of Winds. Hive moves to combat and swings the 4/4 Elemental and the Brine Fang at Ruffigan, and the Wingcrafter and Shinobi at Brennan. In response, Brennan taps 4 to draw a card off Bonder's Ornament, and Ruffigan cycles Windcaller Aven to give his Fierce Empath flying until the end of turn. With priority back in hand, Hive casts Echoing Truth, targeting the Empath, and in response to this, Ruffigan dies. Wanting to get in on the instant speed party, Brennan casts Neonate's Rush, attempting to deal 1 damage to the Shinobi and 1 damage to Hive's face. It also draws Brennan a card. In response, Hive casts Water Wings, also targeting the Shinobi, to give it a base P and T of 4/4, flying and hexproof until the end of turn. Before damage is dealt, and in order to keep from losing my Cage of Hands, I pay 2 to return it back to my hand, and I also pay the 1 to draw a card off Aethermage. Combat damage finally resolves, and Hive uses the Shinobi trigger to bounce Brennan's Skeleton, which effectively erases it from existence. Hive gets the initiative back and ventures into the Catacombs to make a 4/1 Menace Skeleton of their very own. The stack is clear, the combat step has ended, damage is resolved, and I need a nap. Hive slides right through main phase 2 and just passes the turn. Brennan untaps and draws for turn. He starts main phase 1 by casting an Insolent Neonate and a Shadow Alley Denizen. He moves to combat and swings 3 creatures at Hive for a total of 8 damage, 2 of which is unblockable. Hive uses the Skeleton to block the first striking Voldaran Stinger and takes the remaining 6 damage. Brennan regains the initiative and ventures into the Throne of the Dead 3 to reveal the top 10 cards of his library and put a creature from among them onto the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and it gains hexproof until his next turn. He reveals a handful of creatures but chooses the Falconwrath Noble. After shuffling everything back into his library, Brennan casts Stenzia Banquet to deal 7 damage to Hive's face and draw himself a card. He passes the turn after that. I untap and draw. I put a Plains into play, then tap 2 of those Plains to replay Gossamer Chains again. I then recast Cage of Hands, targeting Hive's Harpoonist. Having no good attacks, I move through combat and my second main phase to pass the turn to Hive. They untap and draw for turn. Paying 1 generic mana, they cast Skyblinder's Staff, an equipment that gives +1/+0 to a creature, and that creature can't be blocked by flying creatures. Not for nothing, that card works really well in a deck full of flying creatures. Hive then pays 3 to equip it to the Brine Fang, then moves to combat, choosing to only send said Brine Fang at Brennan. In response to attacks, Brennan activates Insolent Neonate's ability to Rummage, which triggers Falconwrath Noble, so Hive loses 1 life and Brennan gains 1 life. Not drawing into anything relevant, Brennan declares no blocks and takes 7 damage. On damage resolution, it's Hive's turn to spin the wheel in the throne room. Of the revealed cards, Hive chooses Aether Snipe, so it comes into play with a bunch of counters and hexproof, and they get to bounce a non-land permanent. They choose to return the Stinger to Brennan's hand. In response to the bounce, Brennan activates Bonder's Ornament to draw a card. Second main phase, Hive pays 3 for a Tolarian Terror. Being fully tapped out, they pass the turn. Untap, upkeep, and draw for Brennan's turn. He plays a Maestro's Theater to gain a life and go fetch a snow-covered mountain from his library. Off this life gain, Marauding Blight Priest triggers, and Hive and I each lose 1 life. Next, Brennan casts a Thieves' Tool, which ETBs and creates a treasure token. He immediately sacrifices the treasure to equip the tools to his commander. He then pays 1 to cast a Pulse Tracker, which triggers Shadow Alley Denizen, and Brennan chooses to give the Falconwrath Noble Intimidate until the end of his turn. He moves to combat and swings the unblockable Outcast, the basically unblockable Noble, and his nigh unblockable commander at Hive for a potentially lethal amount of damage. Hive can do nothing about the incoming assault except for die. Before damage happens, though, I pay 2 to cast a Teferi's Time Twist to flicker the Cage of Hands that was on Hive's Harpoonist, choosing to have it enter the battlefield attached to Falconwrath Noble at the beginning of Brennan's end step. Damage resolves, Hive is officially eliminated, and Brennan regains the initiative. Second main phase, he recasts Voldaren's Stinger from his hand, then remembers to trigger the Undercity to go fetch a Snow Swamp. He passes after that. I untap and draw for turn. In need of some serious help, I pay 3 total mana to return Cage of Hands to my hand and draw a card off Aethermage. I tap 2 to cast a Sunscape Familiar. I then use both mana from Chancery to recast Cage of Hands, targeting Falconwrath Noble. I also pay 2 to recast Shackles, targeting Stromkirk Captain. I move to combat, sending only the Starnheim Courser at Brennan for 2 damage. I get the initiative for the first time and go get a Plains to play for turn. I move to pass the turn, and Brennan responds by activating Bonder's Ornament to draw a card. Brennan untaps and draws, as one does to start a turn of Magic. He plays a Swamp for turn, then pays to move the Thieves' Tools from his commander over to the Stinger. He pays 5 mana for a Vampire Sovereign, which drains me for 3, and he gains 3. When Sovereign ETBs, it triggers Shadow Allied Denizen, and Brennan chooses to give the Blight Priest Intimidate until the end of turn. He moves to combat and swings every able-bodied creature he has at me. On attack, Pulse Tracker triggers and I lose a life. 8 of the 12 total damage coming at me is unblockable, so I return Gossamer Chains to my hand to have Blight Priest deal no combat damage, and I pay the 1 to draw a card. Unable to stop the horde of vampires, I die to combat damage. Sweet deck, Brennan, and congratulations on the win! Thanks for watching until the end of the video, everybody. Check the links in the description below, and now go play some PDH. Peace!